So now that we've taken apart the computer, let's go ahead and put it back together. Hey, what's up everybody? Dimitri of Caddac Gaming here, and today we will be rebuilding the computer that we took apart last week. We will be going by it step by step, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section below, but I will get through this as detailed as I can so that you can go ahead and put your computer together. Now, a good spot to put the motherboard is actually back on its box. You don't want to be putting the motherboard onto the anti-static bag because those bags are designed to have the static on the outside of the bag. So if you put the motherboard on it, you're going to be exposing it to possible static. Speaking of static, when you're building or taking apart your computer or doing anything around there, try not to be on carpet. If you do have to be on carpet, try to wear some kind of shoes or slippers. More so a sandal than a slipper. You don't want to be creating any extra possible static. If you have an anti-static band, not a Livestrong band, but an actual anti-static band, it's always helpful to wear. You can also plug your power supply into the wall, have it powered off, but you can touch your power supply and that will ground you as well. So you can do that as another alternative. All right, so first things first, let's go ahead and get our CPU socketed in the motherboard. Now, this process will be slightly different depending on if you have an AMD or an Intel motherboard. Intel motherboards have the pins on the motherboard and the CPU does not have the pins, whereas on AMD, the pins are on the CPU and the motherboard is where they get socketed into. Process overall is the same. Make sure to open up the socket and there will be a little arrow on the bottom corner of one of the corners. What you want to do is you want to line that up with the little arrow. You want to line that up with the little arrow on the CPU, like so. So this is going to be our orientation. And what you want to do with an AMD is just drop it in there like that. You shouldn't have to push it in. You shouldn't have to force it in at all. It should just drop right into place. When you do so, you shouldn't be able to wiggle it around very much. And when that's done, you can go ahead and push down this bar and get it clipped in like so. The CPU should now be nice and solid in there and it shouldn't move. Now, if you're putting on a brand new cooler, chances are it has the thermal paste pre-applied to the bottom of it, whether it is the stock one or a third-party one. But if you are doing what I'm doing and you're reinstalling a CPU cooler that you previously took off, you're gonna have to put new thermal paste. There are all kinds of thermal paste out there. I'm just gonna be using the extra thermal paste that came with the Cooler Master. But normally I will use something like Thermal Grizzly or Arctic Silver. They're all pretty good, and there are many ways to apply thermal paste, and everybody will have their own way. I like doing a large piece sized on there. It usually works out the best for me. Getting the thermal paste on there is good. Having a little bit more is usually better than having too little. Most thermal pastes do not conduct electricity. They'll usually say it somewhere on the packaging. But if yours does conduct electricity, you'll have to be a lot more careful. You don't want it to spill onto the motherboard or into the socket for the fear of shorting something. Gamers Nexus actually does a very good video on how all the different thermal paste application styles don't really matter all too much. I can leave a link in the video description below and a card up above for that. So we're gonna go ahead and put our piece size on there. So as you can notice here, the thermal paste is a little bit more watery than most. Thermal paste usually is a little bit more viscous than this. I did leave it on, however, to test it and see how well it would perform, and it seems to be perfectly fine. So this is just the standard Cooler Master thermal paste that comes included with their coolers. And I don't remember it being this watery before, but that's just how it ended up being. And the next part is going to be entirely dependent on your CPU cooler. So make sure to follow the instructions on your cooler to get it installed properly. The Cooler Master 212 is a pretty simple installation. The most important part when doing this is to put even pressure on the CPU when pushing down on your thermal paste. You want to have nice even pressure, and I'm going to start these screws with my fingers. It's a little easier to line them up that way. And now that we've got that started with my thumbs, I can go ahead and use the screwdriver and tighten them a little bit at a time, move over to the next side, and just even pressure all the way around. Now our CPU cooler is on there nice and tight, nice and snug, and the first part is done. So next up we can go ahead and do our RAM. The RAM is very simple, but make sure to check your motherboard for which slots to put your RAM sticks into. Depending on if you're doing a single, double, or quad, it's going to tell you where to do those singles or doubles into. If you don't follow it, like one of my friends, he will go unnamed, did not check his motherboard instruction manual like I told him to, and he was having problems enabling DOCP and XMP on his motherboard. Kept on wondering why his stuff wasn't working properly. I asked him multiple times if he read the manual and he said yes, and turns out that was a lie. So make sure to check where they go, because sometimes it'll be the first furthest from the CPU and the last, and sometimes it'll be the closest to the CPU and the third. So just keep that in mind. Check your motherboard manual. It will tell you which ones to use. Now, if you look at a RAM stick, you will see that one side of the slot is longer than the other. And what you want to do is you want to line that up with the actual socket. There will be a little plastic line in the middle there that will separate the socket into two slots, and you just want to line that up nicely. So next up, what you want to do is you want to use two hands for this. You're going to go ahead and put it into the socket, and with two thumbs, this is a really good way to do it. Two thumbs, push it down until you hear the click, and now it's all done. We'll do that with our second stick. Same kind of idea. Two thumbs, and you're good to go. Next up, let's do our M.2. So with the M.2s, I'm going to quickly go and show you what it would look like with a normal M.2 drive that doesn't have a heatsink on it. So normally when you would slot an M.2 drive into its socket, it will stick out at about a 45-degree angle, like so. And if you can see, it sticks out quite a bit, and then you have to push it down and use the screw to hold it down. So keep that in mind. That's when you know it's socketed in nicely. You can just push against the socket. Don't put too much pressure on there or anything. It's a very easy device to install. However, the M.2 drive that I'm installing has a heat spreader installed onto it, so as soon as I socket this thing in, it's just going to drop down right on top there. And be careful with these screws. Sometimes they will be already pre-installed onto your motherboard, and sometimes they will be in a bag, so keep that in mind. They are very small, so be careful with them. And you're just going to go ahead, socket it. If you need to, you can use your second hand to hold the drive down. Make sure my socketing screwdriver is on the right. And there you go. Very easy to install. M.2 drives have been a fantastic addition to the consumer computer. And now that's really it for the motherboard on its own. What I typically like to do is build the computer entirely outside of the case first and get it running. You don't have to build it completely. All you really need is your RAM, your CPU, your GPU. You don't even need the drives installed right away, and just make sure that it posts. We're going to go ahead and install our CPU fan here real quick. It is a little dusty though, so let me give it a little dusting. And these fans are very easy to install. Slide it on one side, slide it on the other, make sure it clips down. And then you're gonna go ahead and install this into the CPU fan header. So there will typically be two headers here. One is called CPU fan, and then the other one is called CPU opt. They will both run at the same speed, but you need to have at least one fan plugged into CPU fan. These are connected to the temperature of the CPU that the BIOS reads, so make sure that you have yours installed here. If you have a dual fan cooler, and you don't have a Y splitter, you just install one fan to each of these. If you have a Y splitter, you just put it on the CPU fan and you're good to go. Just like so. Now, if you're gonna be building it outside the case like I do, you're gonna wanna get your power supply. All you're gonna need is your 24 pin, your CPU power, and your graphics card power. If your graphics card has its own external power source, some of the smaller ones do not, so you don't need to worry about it, but mine does. So we're gonna go ahead, make sure that the PCIe socket is open. We're gonna grab our graphics card and we're gonna line it up nicely. Make sure that your motherboard is on the end of your box, or else the edge of the graphics card is gonna stop it from slotting in. Line it up nicely and gently push it in. We have a click. Everything is nicely put in there. So let's go ahead and plug our 24 pin. Our CPU. And our GPU. First gotta plug it into the GPU and then we'll plug it into the power supply. So be careful with your graphics card while it's in like this. It has no support on this end, so you just wanna be careful. It will wiggle around a lot, so just be gentle with it. Go ahead, plug your power supply into the wall, turn it on, and I will show you how to quickly jump your motherboard if it does not have a start button. So once you turn on your power supply, if your motherboard has any kind of RGB on it, you should see it turn on. And some motherboards, especially the higher end ones, may have a start button on the actual motherboard that'll allow you to start it without using the case button. But if you don't have that, it's no problem. You can actually jump the motherboard. So these front I/O pins here will connect to your case. If you look at your motherboard documentation, you should be able to figure out which ones are the power switch and ground. And all you need to do is just jump those two pins. So for me, it is these two. And our computer has booted. Now, make sure that you get to the post screen and you can get to the BIOS. Once all of that is good, you can turn off the power from the power supply and you can go ahead and build it into your case. And again, the big reason that we do this is just to make sure that everything is working properly. Nothing is worse than spending the time to cable manage and put everything nicely into your case and then realize that something is dead, something isn't connected properly. It's a lot easier to get to these main components while they're outside of the case. And it's just something that I prefer doing as a safety precaution, just to make sure that I don't have to worry about anything once it's in the case, as mentioned. So just unplug your graphics card, your CPU, and your 24 pin. The 24 pin is usually the most snug, so just give it a nice little rock back and forth and you should be good to go. And take your graphics card out, release the connector, and just lift it out of the socket. Now we're ready to put this into the case. So a good way to prep your case is to take all of the I/O cables and kind of pair them up together with a zip tie or something of the like. They all go to the same area of the motherboard usually, which is the bottom. So it's a good idea to just zip tie them together and feed them through your bottom hole here. If you have any case fans and they connect to a case fan controller, make sure that those are all hooked up nicely. Mine, I have them actually hooked up to my own fan controller here from Deepcool. And I will be attaching that fan that I removed last week from the top here to that as well. And just make sure everything's nice and neat so that when you put down the computer, you don't want to be pinching any cables. So usually I'll hold them from the front and lean the computer back like so. Very important, before you put your motherboard in, make sure you grab your I/O shield. If your I/O shield is separate like this, most of the higher end motherboards now have this built into the actual motherboard. But if it is separate, make sure you grab this and install it into your case first. You don't want to be putting your entire computer together and forgetting to put this in. They go in very simple. Just make sure that you align it the way that the motherboard I/O is, top to bottom. You put it into the side here and you just push it in until it clicks. Like so. Now we can go ahead and put our motherboard in. Be very careful. You don't want to be dragging it against any of these contacts on the case here. But you do have one rounded one in the middle here. So this rounded one in the middle is a good guide. It also helps hold the motherboard up if you were installing this vertically. I don't like installing mine vertically, so just be careful when you're doing that. But do not drag your motherboard against any of these contacts. Be gentle. If you have an air cooler, you can actually hold the motherboard by the air cooler and use your other hand to gently align your motherboard. You're going to want to align it with the AIO and those screw holes like so. Now we have that guide in the middle. It is solid. The motherboard is down on all of those standoffs. Make sure that the back of the motherboard is clear of any cables or wires. You don't want to be having anything possibly shorting behind the motherboard. And now we can go ahead and install all these screws. Your case will come with all the screws to hold down your motherboard, and each of these little spots will actually have a ring around it usually to show you. So you can see here, there's a little bit of a ring around the hole. Makes it very easy to identify where the screws are supposed to go. Again, this is where a magnetic screwdriver comes in very handy. Make sure all your screws are nice and snug, and one of the biggest components, good to go. Now, next up, what I like to do is quickly do the front I/O here so I can get ready to cable manage in the back. So sometimes you'll have to plug these directly into the motherboard. My motherboard actually comes with this little connection here where I can pre-connect all of those cables here and then just connect this one big plug to the bottom. Be careful with these cables, they are very small. I have gigantic fingers, so it is not the easiest for me to work with these, but I get it done. Like so. And now I just push this entire connector down, and that's all done. Next up, we'll do our HD audio. This is usually in the bottom left-hand corner. And our USB 3, for me it is down in the bottom here. All of these will be laid out in your motherboard manual, so make sure to have that page open while you're doing this. It does make it quite a bit easier. My case has a quick slot mechanism in here, so I don't have to actually use any hardware. I can just grab the drives, make sure the connectors are to the rear, and slide them into these slots. Now, very similar for the hybrid drive and the solid state drive I have. This is just an old hybrid drive I have from a laptop, but it's 500 gigs, so I use it for some of the extra stuff I have. And this was the old boot drive, and now it is just used for when I'm editing videos. Go ahead and slide these ones in here. Now, because that other one is a mechanical drive, I'm going to screw it in, but the solid state drive, I do not need to worry about that. Again, how your drives go in will be entirely case specific. They will have different mounting mechanisms, different positions, so make sure you learn your case before you go ahead and start building. Next up, we can put our capture cards in here. I like putting my capture card in before I install my PSU because the power supply is bumped up right against the bottom here and it makes it a little difficult to get into, so we're just going to install that. Make sure the clip is open. And we're going to grab our thumb screws. And normally I will start the thumb screws with my fingers, and then I'll tighten them up with a screwdriver. Now, what I recommend you start doing now is to start wiring your SATA connectors. So these are all of the data portions, and we're just going to go ahead and click these into the two SSDs that are here. We're going to get ready to start cable managing. And if your power supply is modular or semi-modular, you can actually hook up the power connectors here as well. So I'll just grab those. They look like this. This is the SATA power. And we'll go ahead and plug those in as well. We're going to run these through the bottom. So now we can go ahead and lay this down. We could do the same thing for our hard drives. So we can start to get an idea of how we want to cable manage these. So these were all of our SATA data connections, and they're all going to have to go right to the edge of the motherboard here. So we're just going to feed those through. Get them nice and neat, as neat as we can get them. And then our power here is going to go through the bottom. Feed that one back through. Next up, we can get our power supply in. Now, depending on if you have a modular, semi-modular, or non-modular, you may want to put this in sooner rather than later. Mine is a semi-modular one on this computer, so it's not the most difficult to work with. And they're very easy to install depending on your case. With mine, you just slide it into the slot here, you put it up against the back, and you put your 4 screws back in. So now we're going to go ahead and put our power supply in. I actually ended up taking the Elgato out because I figured it was actually going to be a little tight trying to get the power supply in. Now what you want to do is, if your case has a filtered bottom here like mine does, you want to have your fan facing that filtered bottom so it's pulling nice filtered air in. You want to make sure that this fan has good airflow to it. So you don't want to suffocate it. You don't want to put it against anything that is a solid flat surface. You want to make sure that it is vented and filtered. So we're going to grab our PSU like so. We're going to slide it in here. And now we're going to screw it in from the rear. We can go ahead, put our HD audio back in. Might be a little bit more difficult now, but get it in there nicely, and our Elgato. If you notice in my teardown video, the power supply actually had the fan facing upwards, which means it wasn't getting great airflow because it was pushed up against the bottom of this Elgato. So it's a good thing that I redid this video. Now that wouldn't have been the end of the world because it was still getting fresh air. It wasn't put against anything completely solid, but this is a much better configuration, and now it's pulling in filtered air from the bottom. So now what I'm also going to do is I'm going to grab my graphics card power cable. I'm going to plug that in. And we're going to feed all 3 of these cables through the bottom here and start to cable manage. So before we start wrapping cables, we can quickly connect our SATA ports to the SATA connectors on the motherboard here. You should hear them click. And we can also plug in our 2 SATA power here into the power supply. So now we can go ahead and route our CPU, our motherboard, and our graphics card power back through the back of the case here. Now this case doesn't have the greatest cable management in the world, but it does a decent job. We're going to be cleaning all of this up here in a moment. And your CPU power usually has a little bit of a spot up here. go through. Now, if you have any case fans, you're going to want to route these cables as well. I'm actually going to be plugging this into the bottom here, so I'm going to route that down through the bottom. And now we can just grab a quick zip tie. We can zip tie all of these SATA connectors together. Right there. As well as our graphics card power supply. Velcro zips are extremely helpful when doing computers. I highly suggest you pick some up. I will leave a link in the description below for those. We can actually probably get our motherboard in there too. There we go. Let's flip this back over. Let's get our motherboard plugged in here. And we will get our CPU plugged in, and then we can reinstall that top fan that we had to remove to get it out. There you go, so let's put that top fan back up here. So keep in mind that when you're installing fans, the back end here, that looks like this, is where the air is going to be coming towards, and then the front is where the air is going to be going to. So depending on how you want to set up your airflow, I will be doing a separate video on that in the future, but depending on how you want that set up, this is where the air is coming towards, and this is where the air is going. So we're going to have this as an exhaust fan, so it's going to be placed like this. Now we can grab that little fan connector and plug it into my splitter here. We can cable manage this real quick. And last but not least, we can put our graphics card in. I am going to plug that fan into the bottom here, as I mentioned earlier. Depending on your motherboard, you're going to have more or less fan headers, so keep that in mind when you're installing your fans to know how many fans you plan on putting in your case and how many headers your motherboard has. That's why I use that splitter. Now to install the graphics card, make sure the PCIe slot is open and make sure you've removed the back brackets here. Depending on if you have a dual slot like this, a single slot or a triple slot graphics card, you're going to have to remove more or less of these. Go ahead and line it up nicely, keep it nice and even. And you're going to push it down, you're going to hear a click, like so. And now you're going to screw it in to support it. Again, I start these with my thumbs or with my fingers rather, and then I finish them off with a screwdriver. These are a little too heavy for the magnetic screwdriver to hold on to. And we're gonna go ahead and connect that power. And we're all done. That is a finished computer. Now all we have to do, boot it up, get it to post, and install Windows if it's a entirely fresh computer. And that's it. Computer is built. We are good to go. Gonna get this back started up so that my family can watch Lord of the Rings, because this is also our Plex server. And it's pretty straightforward. If you have any questions or comments, feedback, suggestions, anything of the sort, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I get to them as quickly as I possibly can. If you found this video helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. It really helps me out, and it helps you out because you'll be able to know when my future videos come out. Next week, I will be doing a video on what to do after you build your computer, some BIOS things and some software things as well. So subscribe if you want to be tuned in for that. If you have any questions that you would like to have a more of a discussion on, feel free to join the Discord. I will leave a link in the video description below for that, and we can help you out, no problem. Lots of people in there have lots of experience building computers. Everybody builds them a little bit differently, but in the end, we all get them working. As always, I stream on Twitch from Friday until Tuesday. Come check me out, come say hello. If you have any questions, I can answer them there as well. Thanks again for watching to the end of this video. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you next Friday.